What if the reason you're not wealthy has nothing to do with money at all? Most people believe poverty is about a lack of income. It isn't. Income is just the symptom. The real disease lives somewhere much deeper, in the daily decisions so small you don't even notice you're making them. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You could double someone's salary tomorrow, and within 5 years, most of them would be exactly as broke as they are right now. Not because the money disappeared, because the person never changed. By the end of this video, you're going to see your own life differently. You're going to recognize habits you've defended for years, habits you thought were harmless, and realize they've been quietly building the walls of a prison you didn't know you were standing in. So stay with me. Because the most dangerous kind of poverty isn't the one you can see in a bank account. It's the one hiding in your thinking. Let's start with a simple question. Why do two people, raised in the same neighborhood, given the same opportunities, sometimes end up in completely different financial worlds 20 years later? It's tempting to say luck, or connections, or timing. And sure, those things play a role. But if you actually study the people who escaped poverty and the people who stayed trapped in it, a pattern emerges that has nothing to do with luck at all. It has to do with philosophy. Not the kind you study in a classroom, the kind that shows up in how you spend a Tuesday afternoon. Your philosophy about money, about effort, about discomfort. That quiet internal rulebook you never wrote down but follow anyway. This video is going to walk through the specific ways that rulebook keeps people poor. Often people who are intelligent, hardworking, even talented. People who are doing everything except the one thing that would actually change their life. And I promise you, at least one of these is going to describe you. Not to shame you, to free you, because you cannot fix what you refuse to see. Let's begin with the first trap, and it's the one almost nobody suspects. There was a man who worked at a shipping company for over 30 years. Reliable, punctual, never missed a shift. He used to say something that sounded wise on the surface. As long as I'm not in debt, I'm doing fine. On the surface, that sounds responsible. But listen closely to what that sentence actually reveals. His entire measurement of success was the absence of a negative, not the presence of a positive. He wasn't asking, how much am I building? He was only asking, how much trouble am I avoiding? And those are two completely different games, with two completely different outcomes. This is the first trap. Mistaking survival for progress. Most people who stay poor aren't reckless. They're actually incredibly careful. They avoid debt. They avoid risk. They avoid conflict at work. But avoidance was never a strategy for building anything. It's only ever been a strategy for not losing what you already have. And here's what almost nobody notices. You can spend an entire lifetime avoiding loss and end up with nothing, simply because you were never actually building in the first place. Standing still feels safe. But standing still, while the cost of everything around you keeps rising, is not safety. It's slow-motion decline. The lesson is brutal but simple. Not losing is not the same as winning. If your entire financial philosophy is built around avoiding bad things, you will never accumulate good things. You have to flip the question. Not, what am I protecting myself from? But, what am I actually building? But avoiding loss is only the beginning. Because even the people who do try to build something usually sabotage it with the second trap. And this one is sneakier, because it disguises itself as responsibility. Picture two co-workers. Same job, same salary. One of them gets a small bonus at the end of the year and immediately upgrades his car. The other gets the same bonus and puts it somewhere he can't easily touch. 5 years later, one of them is still explaining why he's always a little short before payday. The other one has a cushion most people would envy. Same income. Wildly different outcomes. The difference wasn't intelligence. It wasn't even discipline in the way people usually think about discipline. It was a single unconscious belief. More money coming in means more money to spend right now. This is the second trap. Lifestyle expansion. Every time income rises, spending quietly rises to meet it. and sometimes even exceeds it. It happens so gradually that most people never notice they're on a treadmill that speeds up every single time they get a little faster. Here's what makes this trap so dangerous. It doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels like a reward. You worked hard, you earned more, so surely you deserve to enjoy it. And you do deserve to enjoy some of it. The problem is when all of it disappears into upgrades that vanish the moment you get used to them. A bigger apartment, a newer phone, a nicer restaurant every week instead of once a month. None of these are evil. But strung together, they form an invisible ceiling. No matter how much this person earns, they will always feel like they're barely getting by, because their spending is a mirror that grows exactly as fast as their income. The people who actually build wealth do something almost boring in comparison. When their income rises, they let their lifestyle rise slower than their income. That gap, that small, unglamorous gap between what you earn and what you spend, is the only place wealth has ever been built. Not in the income, in the gap. But here's where things become interesting, because even people who understand this gap often fail for a completely different reason. And this next trap is the one that fools smart people the most. There's an old story about two stonecutters working on the same wall. A traveler stops and asks the first one what he's doing. He says, "I'm cutting stone." Same question to the second one. He says, "I'm building a cathedral." Same task, same hands, same hours in the sun. But one of them was working for a paycheck, and the other was working towards something. Guess which one was still swinging that hammer with enthusiasm 10 years later? Guess which one eventually became a master builder himself? This is the third trap. Working without direction. Most people who stay financially stuck are not lazy. In fact, some of the hardest working people you'll ever meet are also some of the poorest, because effort without direction is just motion. And motion, no matter how exhausting, is not the same as progress. Ask someone who's been in the same job for 15 years, making barely more than when they started, what their 5-year plan is. Often there's silence. Not because they haven't thought about it, but because they've been so consumed with getting through today that tomorrow never got a seat at the table. This is where the emotional weight of this topic really lands, because it's not really about money at all. It's about attention. What you pay attention to expands. If every ounce of your attention goes towards surviving this week, you will keep producing more weeks that need surviving. The trap isn't a lack of effort. It's a lack of a target for that effort to aim at. Compare this to someone who, even in a modest job, has a clear picture of where they're headed. Maybe they're learning a skill on the side. Maybe they've set a number they're working toward, or a date by which they want to be somewhere different. Their hours look identical to everyone else's on a calendar, but every one of those hours is quietly pointed somewhere, and hours that are pointed somewhere accumulate very differently than hours that simply pass. The lesson here is uncomfortable, but necessary. Working hard without a direction is like rowing furiously in a boat with no rudder. You'll be exhausted, soaked in sweat, proud of your effort, and still end up wherever the current decides to take you. Direction has to come before effort, or effort just becomes an expensive way of staying in place. Most people stop here. They accept that they work hard, that they're doing their best, and they let that be the end of the story. Which is exactly why they never break through. Because there's a fourth trap waiting right behind this one, and it might be the most painful to admit. There was a woman who spent years complaining about her manager, about the economy, about the industry she happened to land in, about her upbringing not preparing her for financial success. Every conversation eventually circled back to a reason things weren't her fault. And here's the strange part. She wasn't wrong about any of it. Her manager really was difficult. The economy really had been unkind to her industry. Her upbringing genuinely hadn't taught her about money. All true, and none of it mattered. Because as long as the explanation lived outside of her, so did the solution. This is the fourth trap: outsourcing responsibility. It feels good in the moment. because blame is comfortable. It protects the ego. If it's not your fault, then it's not something you have to fix. But that comfort comes at an enormous price. You also give away your power to change it. Here's what almost nobody wants to hear. Circumstances can absolutely be unfair, and you can still be the only one responsible for what you do next. Those two things are not in conflict. You didn't choose the hand you were dealt, but you are the only one who decides how you play it. The people who eventually build a different life are not the ones with the easiest circumstances. They're the ones who, at some point, stopped asking whose fault this is and started asking what can I actually control here. That single shift in language, from blame to ownership, is often the exact moment everything starts to move. But ownership alone isn't enough either, because there's a fifth trap that catches even people who've done everything right up to this point. And it might be the most invisible one of all. Think about the last time you learned something that made you slightly uncomfortable. A hard truth about your spending, your habits, your choices. What did you do with it? Most people do something very human. They feel the discomfort for about 10 minutes, maybe an hour, and then life happens and the insight quietly evaporates. Nothing changes. Not because they didn't understand it. Because understanding was never the bottleneck. Action was. This is the fifth trap, knowledge without application. In an age where you can learn almost anything from a screen in your pocket, this trap has become more dangerous than ever, not less. Because now people mistake watching a video about discipline for actually being disciplined. They mistake reading about investing for actually investing. The information is right there. The transformation never arrives. There's a strange comfort in constantly learning without ever applying, because learning feels like progress, without any of the risk that comes with actually doing something. You get to feel like you're moving forward, while your bank account stays exactly where it was a year ago. The lesson is simple, even if it stings. One action taken is worth more than 100 insights collected. If you finish this video and simply feel inspired for 20 minutes, nothing in your life will change. The people who change their financial trajectory are the ones who take the very next small step before the feeling fades. But there's one trap that operates before all the others even get a chance to show up. And it might be the hardest one to admit, because it's not really about you at all. It's about who you let stand closest to you. Think about the 5 people you talk to most. Not your entire social circle, just the 5 voices you hear the most often. The ones whose opinions quietly shape what you consider normal. There was a young man who wanted to start putting money aside every single month. Nothing dramatic, just a small, consistent habit. He mentioned it to his usual group of friends over dinner, expecting encouragement. Instead, he got jokes. Someone called him cheap. Someone else said he should enjoy his money while he's young, because you can't take it with you. By the end of the night, he felt almost embarrassed for having brought it up at all. Nothing about his plan was unreasonable. What changed wasn't the plan. What changed was the room. And rooms are more powerful than willpower, because willpower has to fight the room every single day, and willpower usually loses that fight eventually. This is the trap almost nobody wants to examine, because it means looking honestly at the people you love. Your environment sets your definition of normal, and normal is incredibly hard to outgrow without noticing you're doing it. If everyone around you treats debt as unavoidable, debt starts to feel unavoidable. If everyone around you treats ambition as arrogance, you learn to shrink your own ambition just to stay comfortable in the room. Here's what makes this so much harder to see than the other traps. It doesn't feel like sabotage. It feels like belonging. It feels like loyalty. Nobody around you is trying to hurt you. They're simply living out their own version of normal and inviting you, without ever saying it out loud, to match it. The lesson isn't that you need to abandon the people who love you. It's that you need to notice, honestly, whether the room you spend the most time in is stretching you or shrinking you. Sometimes the answer is to bring new voices into the room. A book, a mentor, a single person who's already walking the path you want to walk. You don't need to replace everyone. You just need at least one voice in your life whose version of normal is bigger than the one you grew up believing in. Now, here's where the stakes start rising, because everything up to this point has been about behavior and environment. What comes next is about something even deeper, the invisible ceiling in your own mind. There's a well-known story about how young elephants are trained. A rope is tied around their leg to a stake in the ground. At that size, the rope holds. The elephant pulls and pulls, and eventually learns it's useless to try. Years later, that same elephant, now powerful enough to snap that rope without even noticing, still doesn't pull, because somewhere along the way, it stopped believing escape was possible. That's not really a story about elephants. It's a story about anyone who was told, in ways big or small, that people like them don't end up wealthy. That money is for other kinds of people. That reaching for more is somehow arrogant, or unrealistic, or not meant for someone from where they came from. This is the sixth trap, an invisible ceiling installed so early in life that it feels like truth rather than belief. And here's the cruelest part. You don't even have to consciously agree with the ceiling for it to control you. It operates in the background, quietly talking you out of opportunities before you even consider them. You see a chance to negotiate a higher salary, and something in you says, don't push it. Be grateful for what you have. You consider starting something on the side, and something in you says, that's not realistic for someone like me. You're not lying to yourself on purpose. You genuinely believe those thoughts are just common sense. But common sense and inherited limitation often wear the exact same disguise. The lesson here requires more honesty than any of the others. The rope that's holding you might not exist anymore. It might have snapped years ago. The only thing still keeping you in place is the assumption that it's still there. But even breaking that ceiling isn't the finish line, because there's a seventh trap that tends to appear right after someone finally starts making progress. And it's the reason so many promising starts quietly die. Picture someone who finally starts saving consistently for the first time in their life. 3 months in, something breaks. 2 months later, an unexpected expense wipes out the progress. A little voice creeps in. What's even the point? I always end up back at zero. And this is exactly where most people quit. Not at the beginning, when everything is exciting and new. In the middle, when the results are slow and the setbacks feel personal, as if the universe is specifically against them. This is the seventh trap. Quitting at the exact moment compounding is about to begin working in their favor. Because progress, especially financial progress, almost never linear. It looks like nothing is happening for a long, frustrating stretch, and then, all at once, it accelerates. But you only get to see that acceleration if you're still there when it arrives. There's a story about a bamboo tree that farmers plant, knowing it won't show a single visible sign of growth for close to 5 years. They water it. They tend to it. Nothing appears above the soil. Most people would call the whole project a failure and walk away. But underneath the ground that entire time, the tree is building an enormous root system. Then, almost overnight, it shoots upward and can grow several feet in a matter of weeks. Because the foundation was already there, waiting. Financial progress works almost exactly the same way, and nobody warns you about it in advance. The unglamorous, seemingly invisible stretch isn't the absence of progress, it's the root system. The mistake is judging the tree in year 2 and deciding it was never going to grow at all. Here's an unexpected fact that changes how most people think about this. The visible difference between someone who saved consistently for 2 years and someone who quit after 8 months is enormous. But the difference in their daily effort during those first 8 months was almost nothing. The people who stayed didn't work dramatically harder. They simply didn't stop when it got boring. That word, boring, deserves attention, because it might be the single most underrated force in building wealth. Everyone is prepared for hard. Almost nobody is prepared for boring. And most financial progress is frankly boring. The same habit repeated on ordinary days with no applause for a long time. The lesson: setbacks are not proof that the plan is broken. They're often proof that you're still in the middle of it. The people who eventually escape don't feel less discouraged during hard stretches than everyone else. They've simply decided in advance that discouragement is not a valid reason to stop. Now we're getting close to the insight that ties every single one of these traps together, the one thing beneath all of them. And this might be the part of the video that changes how you see your entire life. Not just your finances, every trap we've talked about. Avoiding loss instead of building, expanding lifestyle instead of expanding assets, working without direction, blaming instead of owning, learning without applying, believing in a ceiling that no longer exists, quitting right before momentum arrives. Every single one of them shares the same root. They are all, at their core, a preference for comfort over growth. Not because the people caught in them are weak, because comfort is the most persuasive salesman that has ever existed. It never announces itself as the enemy. It always shows up disguised as being reasonable, as being realistic, as just taking a break for now. Here's the sentence worth remembering more than any other in this entire video. The poverty that traps most people was never really about money. It was about choosing whatever felt easiest in each individual moment, over and over for years, until those small, easy choices quietly built an entire life. And here's the hopeful flip side of that same truth. If a life can be built by small choices repeated long enough, then it can also be rebuilt the exact same way. Not through one dramatic decision. Through the accumulation of slightly harder, slightly braver choices, repeated until they become who you are, instead of something you're forcing yourself to do. You don't need a different set of circumstances to begin. You don't need permission, and you don't need the version of yourself that has it all figured out. You need one decision today that a comfort-seeking version of you would have avoided. Tomorrow, another one. That's the entire fathered. It was never complicated. It was just uncomfortable enough that most people quietly opted out without ever admitting that's what they were doing. There's one more thing worth understanding before we bring this all together, and it has to do with how differently the same 12 months can be spent by two different people. Imagine two versions of the same person, standing at the exact same starting point, same income, same debts, same 24 hours in every single day. One of them spends this year exactly the way they spent last year. Same spending patterns, same complaints, same vague hope that things will somehow be different eventually, without anything actually changing. The other spends this year applying just one of the lessons from this video. Just 12 months from now, on paper, the difference might look small, a little more saved, a little more direction, a slightly different set of habits. But zoom out 5 years, and that small difference has compounded into two almost unrecognizable lives. Not because one person was luckier, because one person let this year be identical to every year before it, and the other person didn't. That's the part most people underestimate about change. It never feels dramatic while it's happening. It only looks dramatic when you compare the person you became to the person you would have been if nothing had shifted at all. So here's the final question worth sitting with. Of everything we've walked through today, the treadmill of rising spending, the effort with no direction, the blame that feels like relief, the ceiling installed by someone else's fear, the quitting that happens right before the turn, which one has quietly been running your life without your permission? You already know. You knew before this video even reached its final minute. The only thing left is whether today becomes the day that changes, or another day added to a very long list of days that almost changed. The traps are real, but so is the way out. And the way out was never about becoming a different person. It was about making one different decision, right where you're standing right now. Years from now, you won't remember most of the days that made up this stretch of your life. But you might remember this one. The day something finally made sense. The day the pattern became too obvious to keep ignoring. What you do in the next 24 hours will decide which kind of memory this becomes. The day everything changed, or just another day you meant to change something and didn't. If this video shifted the way you think, even slightly, don't let it end here. Subscribe, because the next lesson builds directly on this one, and it might be the piece that finally makes everything click.